Okay, so Barbara, thank you for joining us. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of the Janus case, and in your opinion, what is the path forward for public sector unions?
Well, it's interesting that you start to think about the Janus case in terms of sort of the importance of it, because I think what the Janus case does is it focuses our vision. The work that is going to be demanded of us and that we're beginning to do in the MTA is work that we should have been doing all along. And so there's a weird sort of opportunity in Janus to help us really think deeply about what it means to be a union and what it means for people to be part of the union and actively participating in the union. So in a kind of bizarre way, I'm excited about what it's giving us because the work that we should have been doing all along is about rank and file organizing. It's about members actively participating in being the union on an everyday basis so that they're experiencing their power in the work site, so that they're experiencing that collective power, and then they're using that at the work site and then broader political issues beyond that, political in the broad sense, community issues, what's happening in the State House nationally. So, the key to Janus is that it's demanding that we understand ourselves as rank and file unionists. I think beyond that, it's also, and I hear this from labor leaders that I'm talking to in so many places, it's about thinking about power and our power as a collective and our power with the community. Because the Janus case is both about sort of destroying unions and their impact on the work site, but in doing that, it's about undermining democracy. And so as we build our power at the work site, we have to extend that to be the power of the broader collective to win a better world. I was reading the transcript from the Janus hearing, and what was interesting about it was that the lawyers for AFSCME were all talking about how we need to uphold Abood so that we have labor management peace. And the lawyers for Janus were all saying, if the danger, who's saying this? I'm losing my thought here, but that the danger is that we'll have like labor management conflict. And if you look at what's happening in West Virginia right now, where they have no collective bargaining rights, what they have done is discover their power. They didn't have anything else except to fall all the way back and discover that the thing that we have is each other, and the thing is that we have is each other acting in solidarity. So in a bizarre way, as we prepare for Janus, we are preparing to understand that more deeply about ourselves, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. So to sort of follow up on that then, because I think a lot of, we talk a lot about worksite power, and we have ideas in our mind of what that might be, but I think certainly in New York, a lot of the type of union structures and models we see are the sort of all-knowing president who maybe gets things from the statewide union and sort of throws out these crumbs down to the membership and says, send this fax, send this email, give us more PAC money, and that's sort of how you get involved in your union. So how does that model differ from what you're talking about when it comes to building power at the work site?
I think it's really important that we take time out to think about where we have power and what power means. And part of how I think about that is that the sort of classic business union model, or even sort of a less business union, but sort of a union that's very focused on the legislative process as the way that we're going to make change. Really what I see is that people in those positions see power as up. They look up to the union leadership for power, and they look over to the state house for power. And they see the powers being up here. And I actually think this dynamic is one that we really need to think about even within our progressive caucuses, because I know people on the left who say to me, hey, Barbara, what are you going to do about that? You're the MTA president. Because there's the vector of power is up and outside. And so the key thing that we need to do is create opportunities for people to look at each other and recognize the power that they have together with each other and not look up for power. That's clearly where it is. And so it's a very different way of doing business. As a matter of fact, even within the MTA, we have a program for Janus. It's called the All-In Campaign. And the model that we're trying to get out there is to identify leaders in every local. And those we're calling the ones. And then each leader have them identify 20 or fewer members that are their group that they're going to talk to and communicate with on a regular basis, and have at least 4 conversations in the year. So it's a 124 model that we're talking about. But it's interesting the way it gets talked about in the MTA, and I have to correct people about it all the time, because people in the MTA in staff and leadership positions say, well, we have to make contact. The thing that's important is that we make contact with members. And if we make contact, they'll stay as members. And I have to say all the time, it's not about making contact. It's about creating opportunities for members to talk to each other in ways that allow them an opportunity to identify problems, to develop an analysis of that problem, to develop a strategy for how they're going to correct that based on their analysis, and then to act collectively in order to resolve the problem. And that's very different than making contact. And making contact is what we're sort of getting from some of the nationals. It can move into the other conversation I have to have in the MTA all the time is people saying, so what are the talking points that you're using with members to persuade them that they should stay in the union? And again, like there are people who say that who are progressive in a lot of different ways. And I'm like, I'm not interested in talking points, and I'm not interested in persuasion. The goal is not to persuade somebody by a good argument to stay in the union. The goal is to create opportunities for people to experience the union, and you can't take somebody's experience away from them. Those people in West Virginia standing on that at the State House, calling out their own leaders when their leaders offered them the deal, and they start chanting back to the table, nobody's going to be able to talk them out of the power that they experienced when they did that, and the deep sort of joyful solidarity that you get when you act collectively and you experience your power. So our job at the work site is to have people feel that, be that experience every day. So it's about experience. It's not about persuasion. And I think that's a critical time. I refuse to have persuasion arguments. And of course, all over the MTA, presidents are asking for, can we get a poster that has like the 10 reasons you should stay in the union and the 10 things that you'll lose if you leave the union? I'm like, fine, but like, if that's not going to change it. And in fact, the right wing is going to, if we're based on just sort of rational arguments of self-interest in the way that the neoliberal regime has positioned us, then the right wing is going to have a pretty good argument on that, right? In terms of self-interest, if it's individual interest. And that's why we have to create opportunities for people to identify their shared interest and feel their capacity to not only push back, but to create the world that they want.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing is, especially as it relates to what can people do going back to their workplace. I heard you talking about, individual people from a given local identifying sort of core people who they can go have one-on-one conversations with, not with talking points, but conversations about their work, about their workplace. Identify what are the issues in your workplace, and then develop strategies and campaigns around that to sort of solve those problems collectively at the worksite. So are there any things that you would recommend to help with that strategy? Is there anything that in implementing that sort of nuts and bolts approach, is there anything that you would recommend as resources, or things that local leaders here or local unionists here, resources that they can take back into their union to help with that sort of process?
So the question of resources is a really interesting one, because within the MTA, we, in our last budget cycle, put something like $500,000 into a budget line that would be so that locals could access that in order to work on the all-in campaign. And they needed to sort of make proposals, but we were gonna pass through every proposal. It's like, if you're working on it, you're working on it. We've discovered that very few people have actually asked for that money. Now, there are a couple of reasons, I think, why they're not asking for that money. I think one is we haven't done a good enough job helping them think about, like, how could you use it? And like, one of the things that some locals that have used it well have asked for money to hold a retreat and bring people together and develop their own local strategy for how they're going to do the 124 campaign, or how they're going to, structure their communication so they get out and actually have an opportunity to talk to every member and bring people together. But mostly, I think people haven't used the money because, like, besides pizza and t-shirts, like, what we actually just need is human beings doing the work. And that's sort of the beauty of it. And it's also the hard part of it, because people are working really hard. They're really stressed. They're overwhelmed. They're isolated already. And so it's, we don't need funds to do the work, but we do need to identify leaders. And that is people who know how to listen really well, and not only like listen, take time to listen, but hear, able to sort of pull out in what they hear and what they bring back to the person who they're talking to help that person identify what it is that they're saying, what it is that they're worried about, or they're pissed off about. And that's like an absolutely critical skill, to go all the way back to like the first one-to-one that you're having with somebody, that it's really listening and being able to hear, and then bringing people together. I also think we think about one-to-one sometimes in ways that the vector of energy still stays with the organizer, because the organizer's doing the one-to-one, but the goal of the organizer is to hear from people and then bring them together. And with some understanding from what you've heard about the kinds of issues that they might share. So you facilitate that opportunity for them to talk. Whenever I talk about this, it's so simple in some ways, right? It's like, as a classroom teacher talking about classroom management, classroom community, it's like, we'll get to know your students, make sure they get to know each other, create a community. It's like, yeah, it's easy. I know how to do that. But it's really hard because you have to be deeply intentional about the work. You can't be casual about it. So I think for those of you who are like thinking about how to do that work, in particular in a context where the leadership doesn't understand that work, is thinking about the work as persuasive work, or all about gearing up just for sort of direct electoral politics. I think it's important to develop a community of people, no matter how big or small, to help each other sort of map out, what are your skills, who are the people you can talk to, and how and where you're going to bring people together to begin the conversation. The other thing I think that's really important to be attentive to as we do that work, I was at a conference yesterday where like the first 3 panels were all about the bad guys. And the bad guys are really bad guys, you know, the Koch brothers and, you know, Walmart, like they are bad guys, and they got tremendous amount of power. And it can really be sort of, I feel a little wacky sometimes saying, in the face of these bad guys, if you go out and talk to like 5 people in your building and figure out what you're going to do so that the principal gets off your back and you get control of your teacher evaluation system, and you get more autonomy in classroom, that's going to make a difference, right? It's like, what are you talking about? Like, the world's coming to an end. You know, I had someone there like talking about climate justice. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm just working on making sure people understand that their classroom is their classroom and they get to have professional autonomy in that classroom. But we have to sort of recognize and help each other think about how those are connected. And that's where it comes back to power, because the more people experience themselves as power, they'll enjoy it and they'll move forward. And I go back to West Virginia, like, they didn't go on strike thinking that they were gonna, I saw just now on Facebook, like they've decided it's an indefinite strike. Like, they didn't, I would bet none of them, when they said for the first day they were gonna walk out, this is it, we're going. It was each day that they did it, that they felt more power. I bet when they first went on strike, there's no way they imagined that the leadership would come back and offer them and say, we got a deal for 5%. And they would say, go back to the table. But like that trajectory over the number of days and weeks that they've been doing that is like a beautiful example of how people, you know, we have the capacity to, when we discover our power, to get better at problem solving, to develop more strategies, and to be more willing to take the kinds of risks that we need to take.
Excellent. So I'm going to follow up with one more thing here before we close. So you've referenced West Virginia several times, and sort of the lessons that come from there. And one of the things that it's brought to my mind, there's a book by an author named Joe Burns called Strike Back. And it talks about revitalizing the public sector labor movement by sort of hearkening back to the more militant union times of the 60s and 70s. So do you see West Virginia as something that may be a catalyst for more militant type of union action around the country? Especially because one of the things that I've recognized is, you know, in New York, we hear a lot, well, we can't go on strike because it's illegal. And so one of the things that I love about West Virginia is that it is illegal there. And as you mentioned, they're now on an indefinite strike. So I guess, what are some of the big things we can take from West Virginia? And is this something you see that can become sort of a rallying point for the rest of the country?
Yeah, so the question of sort of what we can learn from West Virginia is interesting, because it absolutely, I mean, it reminds me of Chicago 2010, right? Like across the country, people are seeing sort of the courage of educators and being excited and inspired by it, and seeing that it can be effective. I mean, it's so, like, it suggests to me that we may be at like sort of another moment in history where more people will recognize the power of the collective and be more willing to engage in militant action. And I think that's certainly going to happen, and it's already happening, and it's happening in the sort of same sphere but different work around gun violence, and the students who are walking out, and the educators who are joining them, and the educators who, you know, in the MTA, who've never seen a union, particularly as something that matters to them, who now see the union supporting walkouts and see it as like, okay, that's a place for me, and the union's going to matter for me. So I think that's important. I think the thing we also have to be attentive to, though, as we look at West Virginia, and particularly thinking about those of you who are gathered at this the summit is that we need to be really intentional about a couple of things. One is like, what are the networks that we're building? What are the connections that we're making so that we're going to be able to sustain? Like, who are we working with and how are we going to sustain that? I also think it becomes really important as we're doing this work, and we should be doing it all along, and it's interesting to think about how to do it in a crisis moment like West Virginia versus how I'm trying to do it here in MTA, where I'm trying to sort of excite people to more crisis mentality, is to really work on a political education, has to be a part of it, so that in West Virginia, we don't want people down there thinking that it's just about their state house, but how do we develop, what's the work of a political education so people understand that this is about how capitalism works, and it's about broader structures, and so you can change your governor, but if we haven't changed the political economy, we still have a fight in front of us. And I think, for me as MTA president, I've struggled with like, how do I bring political education into my work so that it's not just the fight in front of us, whether it's about professional autonomy, it's about bully principles, it's about garbage professional development. You want good professional development. If it's about your time and your use of time, if it's about wages and benefits, it's about the fight for 15. How do we be sure that as we're doing that and as people are experiencing their power, that they're thinking about power in the broader context? Who has power? How do we access power? And what does that mean in the broader field? So I think that's a lesson I'm trying to learn, and I'm trying to, I think about it and how do I do it? And my guess is that that's work that there are people in West Virginia doing, but we want that to be happening, to not sort of skip over that. And I think the other piece that's really important to remember, that I've been thinking about a lot, especially sort of in this moment of chaos and opportunity, is that we have to really, in developing a political analysis and doing political education, we have to have a really clear vision for where we want to go. And I used to get annoyed when people will say, well, what do you want, Barbara? Because a lot of times that question actually comes from people who are sort of saying, if you don't want what we want, there's nothing worth wanting. So if you don't want high stakes testing, what are you going to do about it? And what I think we have to do is have a really clear vision for the world that we want, for what does it mean to be an educator. You were talking about social justice education and what does it mean to do social justice education? What does it mean to bring white supremacy into our work as unionists? And what does that mean in terms of the world that we want? What's that world going to look like? What's it going to look like in terms of economic justice, in terms of racial justice, in terms of climate justice? I think if we're going to have a sustainable movement that's really going to not just be like wildcat strikes that flash out and die, we have to be doing that work. And I think for those who are at this conference, that's the work you're doing, that's absolutely critical work. That's the deep work that needs to happen in pockets of unions everywhere, so that there are people who are sort of creating those structures, and I don't mean structures in a bad way, but connections and networks with a clear understanding of what we're doing and where we're going. That's going to sustain us over time and bring us to the world we want.
Excellent.
Makes sense.
Excellent. Yes, it did. Yes, it did. So one final question, which is the most important one. Can you just tell me what baseball team the Massachusetts Teachers Association president cheers for?
The president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association is a Yankee fan. He has incredible confidence in the Yankees, so much so that on my fantasy baseball team, I have 4 Yankees. I'm going all in on the Yankees.
Excellent.
But the last thing I want to say, can I say one more thing?
Sure.
All my peeps are there. Like, I just want to say I miss you all. I love you all. I'm so excited that you're together. I'm so sad that I'm not with you. But like, the great thing about the revolution we're making is that, like, the love and affection and solidarity that we have, even across this stupid video, is really profound. So miss you. All power to you. Take good care.